Okay, I'd like to, if I could have your attention. My name is, for those of you who are guests at the law school today or alumni before the class of, I guess, 2005, my name's Michael Schill, and I'm the dean here at UCLA School of Law. And I want to welcome everybody to the reception, those who I haven't seen outside before this. And this is a really wonderful day for us. I'd like to congratulate the faculty who have built this program. And what's important is, I mean, this is a program that it's not just building a program at a law school. This is building a whole school of thought and a whole school of research for all legal academics. And one of the things that, as a dean, one of the things that you really want, what you really want as a dean is to be able to go to people, both internal and external, and say, my school has the very best in X, or the very best in Y. And one thing I can say when I go give speeches various places, over the past 2 or 3 weeks, I've been running around the country recruiting students to join our first year next year, is that we have a truly unique and visionary program, which is the critical race program, critical race theory and the critical race studies here. And it is immensely important that we have that program. And it's very, very good for us as a school to have that program, not just because it attracts students, and it does attract students from all over the country who turn down all sorts of schools, any school in the country. People tell me, that the reason they're coming here is our critical race studies program, is to be able to study from the best professors in the entire, I shouldn't say that because we have actually some guests who are from other schools, but if you'll forgive me for being a booster for our school, our faculty in this area are the unique, and they're real jewels in our crown. And I'm just delighted that we have this program here, and I'm also delighted that we're having today to celebrate this program and to celebrate the research that's come out of this program. I'm also enormously proud both to meet some of you who are alumni, who I didn't know before coming here, and also to greet those of you who are students here. Because what makes a great program, what makes a great law school, are not just the faculty, even though sometimes that's what the faculty think, but it's you. It's students also who are at the school. And I've found over my past 2.5 years here at the law school that our students in the CRS program are certainly among the most engaged students at the school, among the most committed students in the school. Some of you, quite honestly, are pains in my neck, but nonetheless, I love you all. That's what comes from engagement. For many students, I will not remember them when they leave because I wouldn't have met them. For many of you, I will remember you very well in my dreams and at your reunions. I say that partly joking, but it's really true. I mean, I will get to know many of you better than I'll get to know many other students, and that for me is part of the wonderful nature of being dean at the law school. And I just want to do a couple thank yous. I want to thank all the students who helped put today together, the faculty. Cheryl's had just a huge role in putting all of this together. Cheryl Harris, who is chair of the committee this year, who's doing admissions into the CRS program. I mean, she's just an incredibly wonderful, fine human being, fabulous scholar, wonderful teacher, and I just don't know what else to say about her, but thank you, Cheryl. And of course, and of course, you know, I don't need to do as much thank you since every one of you outside was thanking Saul. Saul, where's Saul located in this room right now? Oh, there you are, Saul. You know, there may be some things at the school that I've done that some of you may not like, but I don't think any of you will say that you didn't like our decision to hire Saul 2 years ago, or really a year and a half ago. So I'm really very pleased with that, and I'm pleased that he's here. And I know that pulling off a 2-day event. In fact, it was funny. Devin Carbato, as you know, is the associate dean of the law school. And you know, the first time I saw the agenda for this was maybe 2 days ago. I was clicking on the website, and I clicked on the banner before it got away. And I went in and I said to Devin, I can't believe what a great program we have here, you know, going on here. And I knew nothing about it, and you know, other than that a program was going to occur. But we have just such fabulous people coming and talking with us, talking to us and with us, that I'm just absolutely delighted. And you know, I'm delighted also to thank one of our sponsors, in particular, Holland and Knight, for its demonstrated commitment to racial equity and diversity in the legal profession, and for co-sponsoring this event today. So thank you very much. Now, today's symposium, I promised I'd be short, and I'm already like 5 minutes over what I said I was going to be, which is like 2 minutes. But you know, today's symposium addresses a number of issues, and really many of the most important social issues facing our nation, issues of race. Prior to coming here, I spent a good deal of my academic career thinking about issues of race, writing about the Fair Housing Act, issues of segregation in housing, and the like. And so these issues I find to be enormously interesting and enormously important. And, you know, one of the most shocking things about the recent controversy about Don Imus was how blatant his racism was, and how blatant the display of racism was. And what the Critical Race Studies program teaches us, and really the insights of the Critical Race Studies program are, particularly for those of us who perhaps aren't feeling the brunt of racism, and what we're going to be discussing over the panels both today and tomorrow, is that even though the perpetrator of racism may not be as ignorant and as transparent as Don Imus was, nonetheless race and racism are often right below the surface in our society today. And one of the very valuable things that I've learned from reading articles, books by many of the people in this room is it focuses my attention on that. It focuses my attention when I don't have Don Imus doing what he's doing. It focuses my attention on seemingly benign things which may not have such a benign underbelly. And it's only through knowledge, and awareness that we're ever going to change the world, change policy, and change law. And that's why it's so important what we're doing here today and tomorrow, because it's only through studying, only through focusing ourselves on all of these issues are we ever going to affect legal change and end up with a much more just and equal society. So I just want to welcome all of you. I hope to see a lot of you today and tomorrow. And with that, I believe I'm going to hand it over to Cheryl Harris. Cheryl.
Thank you all for coming. We are very excited. This is our first inaugural event, and we talked about it being an annual event, and Devin and Jerry looked at me and said, "You've got to be kidding me. We can't do this every year." But we are very delighted to start off and to welcome all of you on behalf of the faculty, on behalf of the staff, and on behalf of the students. We are very happy to have you here and to engage you tonight. We're running a bit behind time, and I do want to, however, just acknowledge that we've had a number of really wonderful responses to our call here, and people who have traveled long and far to join us. And so we are hopeful that you will have an opportunity to stay this evening. Professor Carbato's panel is going to follow right after the keynote speech. Professor Mari Matsuda and others will be on the panel, and it promises to be a very wonderful event. So I know it's running a little late, but I'm hoping that you all will be able to stay. My task actually right now is an easy one. It's to introduce our keynote speaker, Muneer Ahmad. Muneer is a professor of law at American University, Washington College of Law. He holds expertise in immigrants' rights, clinical legal education, labor, employment, and poverty law. He teaches immigration law and international human rights clinic. The most important thing that I really want to say about Muneer, though, is that he has a very clear voice. I have had the pleasure of meeting him and hearing him speak. He speaks with a kind of lucidity and clarity about a lot of issues that are of very great importance to us. One of his pieces, A Rage Shared by Law, really takes up the very difficult question of the relationship between public and private violence against people of Middle Eastern descent in the wake of September 11th. It's a very powerful piece. I commend it to your attention. I also want to say that we drew Muneer away from some very important work. He has since July of 2004 been representing one of the detainees in Guantanamo. And I'm sure as for those of you that have been trying to follow what's been happening, the way in which the rules have been constantly changing with reference to how those trials or hearings or whatever they are to be conducted, this is an amazing task to be taken up. So I want to especially thank Muneer for taking himself away from some very important work and joining us tonight. Thank you.
Well, good evening. I'm really happy to be here. I want to thank Cheryl and all the faculty at the Critical Race Studies program, for whom I have to say I have a very deep personal admiration and, frankly, a very deep institutional jealousy. You all are lucky, and if I could prevail upon my dean to create a Critical Race Studies program, I would, and I will be looking for some ideas on how to do that. I do want to thank you, though, and thank all of you who have gathered. I especially want to thank Saul for helping to bring me out here to have the opportunity to speak with you. I almost didn't make it. When I was leaving Washington this morning, I was having trouble getting a taxi because President Bush was speaking down the street at the Hilton Hotel, and so things were backed up, and I was standing on a street corner thinking, great, this is just what I need, one more reason to be angry with this administration. Which brings me to Guantanamo. The title of my talk is Guantanamo is Here, Race, Rights, and Citizenship at Guantanamo Bay and Beyond. And these are the topics I want to talk about today: race, rights, and citizenship, citizenship in its multiple forms, both formal and informal, legal and cultural, chosen and ascribed. And I want to do this through the lens of my experience over almost the last 3 years now representing a detainee at Guantanamo Bay. I hope to look both at and from Guantanamo and to situate Guantanamo, its legal and cultural meanings within a larger cartography of American racial experience. But I want to start with a story. I have visited Guantanamo about a dozen times since the fall of 2004. On one visit in December of 2005, I met with our client, an individual named Omar Cotter, in a small trailer inside one of the detention camps. Now, typically when we met with our client, it was in a place called Camp Echo, which is a cluster of bungalow-style buildings set around the perimeter of a fenced-in compound. The rooms in which we typically met were divided with a very small cell on one side and a chain metal dividing wall. An empty space was on the other side of that wall, furnished with only a small folding chair and a small folding table and a couple of plastic chairs. There was, in this typical place where we met, one vertical opaque slit window by the door, which suggested the outdoors but didn't actually permit sight of it. The floors and the walls were a dingy institutional white. An air conditioner droned endlessly, keeping the room overcooled. And to sit there for a few hours at a time, as we typically did, was claustrophobic and at times despairing. Well, on this visit in December of 2005, the room in which we met was very different. The walls had wood paneling, and there was an oriental rug on the floor. We sat in overstuffed couches. Omar actually sat in a recliner, what I'm pretty sure was a genuine lazy boy. There was a coffee table, and a TV, and a DVD player, and a refrigerator stocked with snacks. And although it did so crudely, the space was designed to mimic a typical Middle Eastern living room. There was even a hookah in one corner. I swear to God I had to draw in a witness to see this. One could contemplate how the U.S. military goes about requisitioning a hookah, but there it was in the corner. Now, only after several minutes in this altered space did I realize where we were. We were in a high-end interrogation room. The camera in the ceiling and the metal eye hooks in the floor to which detainees are chained were the giveaways. And it was a reminder that Guantanamo is built upon deception, that even what appears normal, or especially what appears normal, is artifice. And it reminded me of the importance of constantly contextualizing the present moment. The high-end interrogation room exists in opposition to the low-end interrogation rooms, rooms I've never been allowed to see. Those spaces designed not for momentary comfort, but for threats of permanent pain. Omar had been in the full living room before, but he had also been in those other rooms, subjected to harsh interrogation, including one instance at the age of 16 when soldiers used him as a human mop, lifting him up off the ground, pouring solvent on him, and using his body to clean up the floor on which he had urinated because they hadn't allowed him a bathroom break. In those other rooms, Omar was threatened with rendition to other countries, where he was told he would be raped by older men. And so these two interrogation rooms, the one seemingly normal, the other the site of deliberate dehumanization, exist side by side, their histories so conjoined as to question whether they are in fact separate spaces, or are instead mutually constitutive of a single reality. Now, many of you, I'm sure, have some basic knowledge about Guantanamo. You may know that at one point there were as many as 800 people who were detained there. Today there are about 400. They're detained there indefinitely. Most have never been charged with any crime, and by the administration's own statements, never will be. They face indefinite detention without charge, potentially for the rest of their lives, and this is on the claimed authority of the administration that they are enemy combatants. As I have suggested in the context of Omar's case, Guantanamo is not merely a detention center. It was designed as an active interrogation center, and there's a critical distinction there. One of the things that we know happens, and we have this from multiple sources, everyone from clients to the FBI, telling us that there were extreme forms of interrogation methods used, things that clearly passed into the realm of torture. There are, to be sure, a lot of legal issues to talk about with respect to Guantanamo. What I'm going to try to do today, what I intend my comments to be, are more of an ethnographic description of Guantanamo, the degraded legal process there of the military commissions, and some, though not all, of the lawyering in which we've engaged in that process. This is to say that I'm conceiving of and describing Guantanamo and the military commissions there as a cultural phenomenon and a set of cultural practices, attempting to locate it geographically, but also in the imagination, and to map a set of relationships between this seemingly foreign place and the seemingly domestic, the strange and the familiar, the other in the self. It is, in this respect, a story of encounter, and to the extent that it sounds at times like a travelogue, that is intentional. Alternatively, it might be seen as a colonial office report, or perhaps more appropriately, a post-colonial office report, an account sent to the Home Office of a strange and foreign land in which the Home Office is in fact deeply implicated, and by which the homeland is fundamentally reshaped. In this ethnography, I am a very participatory participant, observer, and the account I provide is made unapologetically through the frame of client representation. Now, my hope is to suggest some of the theoretical implications of Guantanamo and the military commissions, a process that only about 10 people have ever been designated for, and which the vast majority of people will never see. I want to suggest some of these implications, particularly with respect to relationships among race, rights, citizenship, and law. In this regard, my interest is in examining how a legal framework and a cultural phenomenon that regulates non-citizens detained outside the territorial United States necessarily implicates multiple conceptions of citizenship that traverse national boundaries. In so doing, I seek to demonstrate at a theoretical, conceptual, and political level that while geographically remote, Guantanamo is tethered to the territorial United States, and in the legal, cultural, and political imaginations is contiguous with it. The client representation in which I've engaged with colleagues at the law school at American University, with some of our students, and with others, is, in my view, very much of a critical race project. Now, at a theoretical level, critical race theory demands our steadfast attention to racial subordination and its materiality, the historical and structural roles of law in such subordination, and the reconstructive, even transformative potential of law to challenge subordination. Methodologically, critical race theory makes a welcome plea for praxis and insists upon narrative as one critical site of contest. Indeed, one of the great insights of critical race theory, echoing Gramsci and implicit in narrative theory, is that narrative not only adds new, previously excluded voices, but calls out law's silent stories. Narrative contest is won most decisively when it appears that there is no contest at all. That's the power of history, stasis, orthodoxy, and convention. And it's also the imperative for radical oppositional counter-narrative. Now, the government has worked enormously hard to establish the story of Guantanamo, a story that no one would contest. But when we push, we find how thinly constructed it is, as thinly constructed as those interrogation rooms. And we find what stories, untold stories, lurk beneath. For over 4 years, the Bush administration has described the detainees at Guantanamo as the worst of the worst, as hardened terrorists, and as trained killers. The rhetoric has been incessant and extreme. These are the kind of people we've been told who would chew through the hydraulic cable of a C-17 cargo plane to bring it down. The government coupled these characterizations with menacing imagery, as the Pentagon released pictures of men being transported to Guantanamo while strapped to the floor of a plane, heads covered, hands shackled, an American flag draped above. And still more pictures of men in orange jumpsuits crumpled on the ground behind chain-linked fence. Taken together, these images help to construct a state iconography on the war on terrorism, and I use war on terrorism in scare quotes. They told a narrative of transnational forces of evil committed with fanatical zeal to the destruction of the United States, to which the U.S. then responds with military and moral superiority, thereby subduing the enemy, neutralizing him, rendering him abject, and under the vigilant eye of America, ensuring that he remains broken and contained. In this regard, we might think about the value that Guantanamo serves, international condemnation notwithstanding, in purchasing domestic faith in the belief that the homeland is secure. Guantanamo is evidence of the government's success, visible but not too visible, close but not too close, in subduing evil forces. Thus, Guantanamo fills an existential need for security. That we obtain such security through the quarantine of darkened bodies is a familiar compromise, and one that is not easily disturbed. We need only look to the very soil at Guantanamo where detainees have been kept since 2002 and remind ourselves that that's the exact site at Guantanamo Bay where Haitians were quarantined in the 1990s. And we need look only to our own prison industrial complex in the United States to think about the ways in which the quarantine of darkened bodies purchases our homeland security. The dark-bearded turbaned men of al-Qaeda are central figures in this state iconography. And though pictures of the detainees as they now appear have not been released, it seems fair to say that these essentialized notions of the terrorist are what Guantanamo is meant to conjure. It's men like these we are meant to believe who are detained there. My client, Omar Cotter, was a 15-year-old boy when he was taken into U.S. custody. When Omar was transferred to Guantanamo, he could not yet grow a beard. His wisdom teeth had not come in. He had not completed puberty. Now, at the age of 20, Omar has spent nearly 1/4 of his life at Guantanamo Bay. The charges against Omar are serious. According to the U.S. account, Omar was in a house in Khost, Afghanistan, that was raided by U.S. forces. After a firefight that lasted several hours, including aerial bombardment, U.S. forces entered the house to find everyone dead except for Omar, who was badly wounded. At this point, the United States alleges Omar threw a grenade that killed a U.S. soldier, and he now faces murder charges and several other charges before this military commission process. Again, let me hasten to add that Omar will be in the extreme minority of Guantanamo detainees who are ever charged or ever given any kind of process at all. Now, hovering in the background of the formal charges against Omar are a variety of suspicions and allegations about his family. His father, in particular, is suspected by the U.S. to have had terrorist ties, and his family is deeply unpopular in Canada. Why Canada? Because Omar is a Canadian citizen. Taken together, the formal and informal charges against Omar assimilate him into a barbaric clan of cold, calculated, murderous men, finding a special place for him in the government's iconography of terror. Now, of course, Guantanamo did not single-handedly construct the racialized notion of the terrorist, but instead helped to reinforce a process of racialization that began in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. We saw then how racially directed immigration enforcement and detention practices, coupled with thousands of incidents, literally thousands of incidents of hate crime and hate violence, including 22 murders, helped to consolidate the disparate identities of Arabs, Muslims, and South Asians into a newly minted monolithic category in the American racial lexicon, the Muslim-looking person. As Letty Volpe has argued, this racial category was inherently oppositional to a newly consolidated post-9/11 national identity and acted to expel Arabs, Muslims, and South Asians from the cultural or effective non-formal citizenship they might otherwise have enjoyed. Of course, Muslim-looking is a peculiar category, as it collapses phenotype and faith and conjures a literal face of religion. That is, we know what a Muslim, and therefore a terrorist, looks like. And I want to suggest that though this category is ostensibly about religion, it embraces various visual cues that we might associate, correctly or not, with religion, such as turbans, beards, and veils. It opens a space hovering somewhere between religion and race, and indeed has significant racial valence. The Muslim is different and deficient not only in appearance, but in constitution. The menace is not merely the God who is worshipped, but the broader set of cultural practices, modes of living, and systems of belief that are attributed, once again, monolithically, to more than 1 billion people in the world. This, I think, helps to explain why when 3 detainees hanged themselves last summer, the Guantanamo commander there called the deaths, and I'm quoting, acts of asymmetric warfare. That's to say that they were Islamic suicide bombers to the end, not human beings responding to the unending despair of Guantanamo. Now, we know that radical dehumanization is a prerequisite to legal erasure and to normalized psychic and corporal destruction. We know this from the history of African Americans, from the first slave ship to today. We know it from the Holocaust and from the genocides from Rwanda to the former Yugoslavia to Darfur, and we know it from the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. The scale of Guantanamo is admittedly far smaller, and the historical circumstances are different, but the phenomenon of normalized violence, and racial violence at that, is much the same. Indeed, in many ways, Guantanamo is a normalizing project. Days at Guantanamo, and I've spent many more there than I care to, are quickly routinized, and with routinization comes normalization. If you travel to Guantanamo after landing on the military airstrip there, a ferry takes you across Guantanamo Bay itself, from the leeward to the windward side. For 15 or 20 minutes, it's the calm beauty of the Caribbean. Then, arriving at the other side, you encounter a giant desalination plant. That's necessary because Castro cut off the supply of fresh water to the base. A short drive up a winding hill, you enter what has been consciously designed to mimic a small town in 1950s Middle America. A single road, Sherman Avenue, runs from one end of the base to the other, along which one finds an outdoor movie theater evocative of drive-ins of a bygone era. There's a McDonald's and an A&W root beer, a bowling alley, and a public library. There's a large laundromat and the Navy Exchange, which is a combined grocery and department store. On our first visit there, my first visit to Cuba, ironically, tragically, it was impossible to find a good cup of coffee. But they've since begun serving Starbucks at one small outlet. There are athletic fields and housing developments that look like suburban subdivisions in California or Washington. There's even a school for the kids on the base. The speed limit is 25 miles per hour, strictly enforced in large part to protect the iguanas, who are protected by the Endangered Species Act. A point that was not lost upon Justice Souter when this was argued in the Supreme Court. And this speed limit reinforces the sensation that time goes slowly at Guantanamo. But the aspiration of small-town normalcy stands in permanent tension with the dystopic detention camps erected just a few miles away from the town center. To get to the camps, one winds through the hills of the base, and after cresting the last of these, a series of low-slung buildings appear on the horizon, the shimmering waters of the Caribbean behind them. From a distance, you could be forgiven for mistaking this for a luxury resort. But as one, it's that beautiful, it really is. But as one approaches, the multiple checkpoints, the concertina wire, and the guard towers betray that momentary delusion. And the reality of the camps, their maximum security, and their deliberate despair overwhelm the senses. Now, some of this camp imagery is difficult to shake. Many of you will know that in Muslim countries, the call to prayer, the azan, is heard 5 times a day. In the old days, a muezzin ascended a steep minaret to make the call. Today, it's broadcast from loudspeakers attached to minarets. At Guantanamo, too, the call to prayer is heard, though detainees have complained that it's not broadcast all 5 times and that the government tries sometimes deliberately to disrupt it. But what's more jarring is to see that the recorded call is broadcast from loudspeakers not atop minarets, but attached to the guard towers encircling the camps, each one staffed by armed guards and each emblazoned by an American flag. And so the detainees' call to prayer issues nearly from the barrel of their captors' guns. Part of the strangeness of Guantanamo is that these two worlds exist side by side, the one self-consciously normal, the other a carefully constructed project of dehumanization. The town's aspiration of normalcy is made all the more urgent by the aberrance of the camps. The service members who work in the camps but spend their off hours in the town cross between these two worlds daily, traversing the divide known as the wire. The detainees, of course, are forever delimited. Their containment enables the service members' freedom, and the barbarity of the camps helps to constitute the normalcy of the town. Now, the normalcy of Guantanamo is called further into question, or perhaps is reestablished, when one begins to appreciate its racialized labor market. Almost all the laborers at the base, and there are many, the janitors and food service staff, the landscapers and maintenance workers, are Filipino, Haitian, and Jamaican migrants, referred to as third country nationals, or TCNs. The dependence on migrant workers for low-wage service industry labor in the United States and the phenomena of privatization and contingent labor therefore extends to Guantanamo. It's a reminder, too, that the penal colony that is Guantanamo Bay is indeed colonial. Moreover, it inaugurates recognition of a pervasive yet complex racial economy at Guantanamo, where black and brown migrant labor services a multiracial U.S. military that in turn incarcerates and interrogates Muslim men. In this regard, even though we were in the legal Netherland of Guantanamo, a place where we were told that law did not apply, it seemed impossible to escape the multiple taxonomies of citizenship, and in particular, their racial, national, and labor dimensions. Now, the economic and operational connections between Guantanamo and the United States are not merely coincidental. Consider, for example, that one of the main detention facilities at Guantanamo is modeled after a federal penitentiary in Indiana, and the other is patterned after a prison in Michigan. Thus, while the interrogation practices of Guantanamo are undoubtedly unique, one can imagine the technologies of long-term incarceration being perfected on black and brown bodies in the Midwest, only to be transferred to Guantanamo. This brings me then to talk a little bit about what is the legal status of the detainees at Guantanamo, because their legal status is both a product of and a contributing factor to this dehumanization project. The administration claims to detain individually, indefinitely and without charge anyone whom it designates as an enemy combatant, a term that's been defined solely by the executive and a definition that has varied over time. At one point in proceedings in federal district court in Washington, the government conceded that their definition of enemy combatant was so broad that it would encompass a little old lady from Switzerland who wrote a check to an Afghan orphanage that, unbeknownst to her, was actually used to support the Taliban. A senior judge in the district court asked the lawyer from the Department of Justice if this would meet the definition of an enemy combatant. The Department of Justice said unapologetically, yes, it would. The administration has used this enemy combatant category in contradistinction to prisoners of war who, under the Geneva Conventions, would be entitled to a range of protections, including limitations on their interrogation and certainly on cruel and human degrading treatment, not to mention torture. The position of the administration is that the Geneva Conventions do not apply, a position that was partially repudiated by the Supreme Court in the case of Hamdan versus Rumsfeld last year. Their claim is that they may detain and interrogate enemy combatants for the duration of hostilities in the war on terror, which, because this metaphorical war may last beyond our lifetimes, constitutes indefinite detention without charge. Now, this disclaiming of Geneva Convention applicability is in some ways the thin end of the government's argument. Their fully articulated position, made repeatedly and unapologetically, is that the detainees at Guantanamo have no rights at all, under any source of law: U.S. constitutional law, U.S. statute, international treaty, customary international law. By the government's account, these are rightsless people. Let me come back to citizenship. Hannah Arendt famously defined citizenship as the right to have rights. What we see at Guantanamo is the inverse of citizenship: no right to have rights, a rights vacuum that enables extreme violence. But the dehumanization that results migrates from that post-colonial scrap of empire, threatening the citizenship claims of even those inside the territory of the United States, and placing Guantanamo at the center of a struggle not merely for rights, but for humanity. I want to talk very briefly about the military commissions process. This is what I can only describe as a degraded legal process to which a very small number of people will ever be entitled. It's one that has already been stricken once by the Supreme Court as violating both the Uniform Code of Military Justice as well as the Geneva Conventions. It's come back in a new iteration with congressional authorization, which has a system now that looks remarkably like the old one. I want to talk a little bit about this and relate it back to the issue of lawyering and to citizenship and rights. Now, arguably, the military commissions represent the acme of legal process at Guantanamo, which is a frightening proposition. I'm just going to highlight a couple of infirmities of the commission system and then talk about the Military Commissions Act, which was passed by Congress and signed by the President at the end of last year. This is, for the law people, a little red meat doctrine being thrown your way. For the non-law people, think of it as roughage. Now, the fundamental problem with the commissions was that despite the repeated invocation by the administration of the rule of law and assurances that the commissions would be full and fair, that was their language, this was a system devoid of rights and with very few rules, and even those rules that existed shifted seemingly at will. Among the problems with the system, there were no real rules of evidence, no rules of discovery, no rules of decision, no rules of precedent. When my military co-counsel, Colonel Colby Vokey, who's based at Camp Pendleton here in California, asked the presiding officer if decisions from other courts would apply, decisions from U.S. district courts, for example, or military courts, or international courts, or courts of other countries, he was told, file a motion and you'll find out. This was a common law system, but a common law system at time zero. We were told to refer to this non-existent body of law as commission law, with a capital C and a capital L, as if capitalization alone could magically endow an ad hoc system with the majesty of law. Commission law, therefore, was constituted simultaneously by everything and nothing. It was no law at all. Certainly, this is how the detainees experienced it. As one guard said to a detainee, quote, "You are in a place where there is no law. We are the law." This brings me to the Military Commissions Act and citizenship, and here I want to talk a little bit about formal or juridical citizenship. The Military Commissions Act does many things. I want to highlight just two. First, it, for the first time, gives congressional authorization to the use of military commissions to try suspected terrorists of war crimes, thereby overcoming one of the two major objections made to the commission system by the Supreme Court in the Hamdan case. Second, the Military Commissions Act purports to strip the right of habeas corpus from all detainees, the relative handful who will face commissions, as well as the vast majority who will never be charged. Both of these have troubling implications for non-citizens both inside and outside the territorial United States. Now, regardless of political orientation, everyone concedes that military commissions offer significantly less substantive and procedural protection than either a court-martial or criminal proceedings in federal court. Indeed, the defining characteristic of military commissions is their deviation from standard criminal law practice. The stated rationale for this deviation, both historically and in the contemporary moment, is that the exigencies of war make it impracticable to afford the full panoply of rights to alleged war criminals. So, for example, the government shouldn't be held to the same standard on chain of custody when the alleged crime occurs in a remote battlefield as when it occurs in a time of peace in, say, downtown Los Angeles. There is some sense to this argument. But military commissions, both before and after the Military Commissions Act, are reserved for non-citizens only. Citizens, even citizen enemy combatants who are charged with war crimes, are tried either by court-martial or in federal court under the Federal War Crimes Act, both of which offer a full range of procedural and substantive rights. Consider, for example, two individuals, one a U.S. citizen, one a non-citizen. Both are captured in exactly the same location for engaging in exactly the same conduct, and they're charged with exactly the same substantive war crime offense in exactly the same time. One will get a full-fledged legitimate trial, either in federal court or in a court-martial. The other will get the degraded proceedings of a military commission. And so it is not the exigencies of war that lead down the path to substandard justice of commissions. It's citizenship and citizenship alone. And the result is a two-tiered system of justice with citizenship, here formal citizenship, as a dividing line. The Military Commissions Act acknowledges frankly itself within the text the inferiority of the commissions, as several provisions of that act hermetically seal off the jurisprudence, and I'm using that term lightly, of the commissions from application in war crime trials in either courts-martial or in federal court, and vice versa. This reflects, I think, a jurisprudential anxiety about the commissions and a concern that its substandard proceedings and decisions, reserved explicitly for non-citizens, not contaminate the legitimate proceedings in courts-martial and federal courts to which citizens, including U.S. service members, are entitled. This has, I think, obvious and grave consequences for our conceptions of formal citizenship, as it places enormous weight on alienage and hardens the rights divide between citizens and non-citizens, even lawful permanent residents. It supports a regime of rights allocation in which so-called accidental citizens like Yasser Hamdi get a full panoply of rights, but a long-term lawful permanent resident gets a degraded form of justice. I'll note just briefly that this citizen-non-citizen divide is hardened further and perhaps even more problematically with respect to habeas, the great writ, that basic protection against arbitrary executive detention, because the Military Commissions Act seeks to strip the right of habeas corpus only for non-citizens, not for citizen enemy combatants alleged of exactly the same conduct. Stripping habeas from individuals detained by the executive based solely on an executive determination that they are enemy combatants is tantamount, as I've said, to endorsing indefinite detention. And yet it's only non-citizens who are subjected to this. That's to say that John Walker Lind, a U.S. citizen, would get to keep his habeas rights, but Omar Cotter, my client, a Canadian citizen, would not. Importantly, these citizenship distinctions are not confined geographically to Guantanamo. Rather, they can and do apply to non-citizens within the territorial United States, such as Ali El-Mari, a non-citizen student arrested in Peoria, Illinois, and whom the administration seeks to hold indefinitely and without charge here in the territorial United States. I want to suggest to you that it's like that old saw. If it plays in Peoria, we can expect it will play elsewhere too. Now, in both of these examples, it's difficult for me to see the principled rationale for a citizenship distinction, even if such a distinction is legally permissible. But once we determine that non-citizens at Guantanamo and in the territorial United States are deserving of only a degraded form of justice, we inevitably reify all sorts of other invidious distinctions between citizens and non-citizens of all racial and ethnic backgrounds, not merely in law, but in politics and culture. This is to say that a reconfiguration of citizenship for Arabs, Muslims, and South Asians cannot be quarantined, geographically, ethnically, or racially. The unperfected citizenship claims of other immigrant communities and other communities of color are implicated as well. Let me end then with a return to rights and citizenship. When I began this work, I understood rights and rights-based strategies in fairly instrumental terms. In particular, I looked at the commissions and in many ways saw a mathematical proof for the central theorems of critical legal studies. Law transparently manufactured by and covering for politics, legal process intended to meet political goals, and a radically indeterminate system based upon infinitely manipulable classifications as represented paradigmatically by the administration's ever-shifting definition of enemy combatant. Despite this, and consistent with the insights of critical race theory, my colleagues and I chose to engage in rights-based strategies, rights in the Constitution and statutes, rights in international law and international treaty, and to inhabit the tension between the emptiness of law's practice and the fullness of its promise, to recognize, as people like Mario Matsuda have written about, that both might exist simultaneously, in that by invoking rights we believe to protect Omar, even the politically motivated military commission system might be forced to recognize them. I still think that's the right approach, but in the course of our representation of Omar, I've come increasingly to view rights not just for their strategic value, but as something far more essential to human life. When Hannah Arendt described citizenship as a right to have rights, she conceptualized rights as a membrane, poised between the state and the individual. What Arendt saw, and the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben has recently revived, is the idea that a confrontation between state power and the individual, unmediated by rights, reduces the individual to bare life, or naked life, which is life without humanity. It is this unmediated, unmitigated confrontation that enables the rendering of the human inhuman, animal, and savage. It's this rights-free confrontation that permits torture, the hand of the state, encumbered by no laws except the laws of physics. And it is this unmediated confrontation that permits the transmogrification of a child into a terrorist. For Arendt, to be a citizen is to be human, and to be anything less is merely and barely life. The remoteness of Guantanamo gives a false sense of comfort, as if its ugliness can be quarantined to that liminal space. But whether doctrinally in the form of the Military Commissions Act or politically in the form of an ever-expanding executive, Guantanamo is not an island. Rather, it is in the legal imagination contiguous with Nogales and Eagle Pass, Detroit and JFK, the fields of California's Central Valley, the meatpacking plants of the Midwest, and the prisons of Indiana and Michigan. In this way, no matter how remote it may seem, Guantanamo is here. It is from here, it is of here. It is ours, and it is our responsibility. Thank you.
I want to thank Professor Muneer Ahmad again for coming all the way out here and being with us. Because we want to get you